let me know if I haven't said something I'm supposed to say. Well, welcome, everybody. It's a real pleasure to have you join us here. My name is Eric Schwartz, and I'm the president of Refugees International. Refugees International is a reporting and advocacy organization whose goal is to bring the perspectives of those who are forcibly displaced as a result of conflict, persecution, natural disasters, to bring those perspectives into the halls of political power. And traditionally, our organization has been focused globally beyond the borders of the United States, but a global organization has to recognize that the globe includes the United States and the border of the United States. So, especially in the past couple of years, we as an organization have increased our focus and attention on issues like the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, issues related to temporary protected status, and of course, issues relating to asylum and the border. We are delighted to host this first event of a Voices from the Border series, the goal of which really is to bring to Washington perspectives from those who are involved in issues relating to protection at the southern border of the United States, and to humanize the experience and to bring a greater understanding of what's going on to policymakers in Washington. So we're really delighted to inaugurate this series today. I also want to thank the staff of Refugees International, especially our communications staff and others, for putting this event together, and also organizations with which we have collaborated, the Women's Refugee Commission, the American Immigration Council, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and others. So at this point, I'm going to turn the floor over to Yael Shaker of our staff, and I think we're going to have a really interesting, compelling, and informative session. Yael, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Eric, and thank you guys so much for coming. I'm sitting on a mic. Okay. So I left my job as a historian of the United States immigration and asylum law and policy and started working at Refugees International in January of 2019, just as the Remain in Mexico policy, which is going to be the focus of our conversation today, began rolling out across the border. And it fundamentally changed the asylum system basically by forcing people who had reached U.S. soil back over the border to await adjudication of their claims in immigration court, but wait in Mexico during that time. And I'm going to talk a little bit, just basic overview of the policy, and as I do so, introduce the panelists who I've met on my border visits trying to investigate this policy. And I know there's some other people in the audience here who have also made trips to the border. So I'll introduce the panelists, then we'll have a conversation, and then there'll be plenty of time to ask questions at the end. And I encourage especially those people who have been to the border and also people in Washington who want to know more about things that we haven't touched on to ask questions. So the policy first began in the San Diego, Tijuana sector, and that's where I met Paulina, our first speaker, who began to help some of the returned families at her shelter in Tijuana, which is right near the Chaparral, the central the square where people are returned, and where the metering list had been maintained for a long time. And where which people signed up to sort of ask for asylum. They had to wait on a list before being able to ask for asylum. And then after the Remain in Mexico policy was rolled out, were then sort of dumped back into Tijuana without any place really to stay. while they're awaiting their court dates. All the judges in San Diego Immigration Court are now dealing with these cases, pretty much every single judge, and many of us have seen what's going on there. Paulina introduced me to some families who were really facing incredibly difficult decisions because of the Remain in Mexico policy, and she'll speak more about that. Next, the Remain in Mexico policy rolled out in the El Paso Juarez sector of the border. That's where I met Taylor Levy. At the time I met Taylor, she was still working at Annunciation House, which is a major shelter in El Paso, and had established basically a major shelter network, I think it was over 30 shelters, to accommodate the hundreds of families every day, which were released by DHS in the spring of 2019. Most of those shelters are no longer full, if functioning at all, because over 17,000 people have been returned to Mexico in the El Paso, to Juarez alone. So just there, that's how many people have been returned. And Taylor has shifted her focus to work with these families who are in desperate need of just the basics: shelter, food, work, school, medicine, and are under constant threat of violence. I not have only watched Taylor serve as friend of the court for many families lacking representation, but also turned to Taylor in July when I received a desperate call for help from a mother I had met in Juarez who was so hungry and scared and worried about her sick child that she was considering returning to Honduras. And Taylor, where her husband had been killed, and she was still under threat. Her family was still being threatened by the people who had killed her husband. So Taylor helped this woman, and she later helped Fatima, who will be speaking with us, and is an asylum seeker who had been in the Remain in Mexico program, who Taylor will introduce when she speaks. The U.S. has effectively pressured the Mexican government to accept returned asylum seekers all across the border now. And so the Remain in Mexico policy next rolled out in the Rio Grande Valley, which is across from the state of Tamaulipas in Mexico, and have returned, and have also actually created these special inaccessible port courts to hear cases of people returned to Nuevo Laredo and Matamoros, cities on the Mexican side. I have visited both of those very dangerous cities on the Mexican side of the border, and I have spoken to asylum seekers who were kidnapped, making their way to the port courts for their court dates. The conditions in the growing tent encampment, which is basically a huge unofficial refugee camp right near, just feet from the international bridge in Matamoros, is abominable. So bad, in fact, that parents waiting there for their court dates are sending their young children into the US alone, which is something that is a theme I'd like this panel to focus on, which is basically how the Remain in Mexico policy is affecting families, causing desperation, separation, trauma in ways that should be better known, and invoke the same outrage as the more overt policy of family separation the administration was engaged in last year. And Ursula from the Women's Refugee Commission, who sort of will be moderating with me and will be introducing Taylor, we'll talk precisely about this and the work that the Women's Refugee Commission has done on this issue. Just want to say one last thing before passing the mic to Paulina. Although Fatima is now out of the Remain in Mexico program in ways that Taylor will describe and talk to her about, and she's pursuing her asylum claim in the United States, DHS still would not permit her to travel to Washington to be here with us today. In person, which is why we're doing this Skype talk. Indeed, the Remain in Mexico policy is designed to push asylum seekers away from the United States, to make them disappear from our border communities, our newspapers, our policy discussions. You know, if policymakers visit the border on the US side, they're not gonna see asylum seekers in the way they had before they were being returned to Mexico. The asylum seekers are on the Mexican side. This event and our subsequent Voices from the Border events are pushing back against this disappearance. Fatima was seeking asylum here. The desperate Honduran mother in Juarez, who I mentioned earlier, has a father living in Austin. We must keep these families in our sights. The Remain in Mexico policy has now rolled out further to Piedras Negras, to Arizona, and additional policies restricting asylum or returning asylum seekers to danger have been put in place at the border. Some of these policies will be the subjects of future Voices to the Border events, which I encourage you all to come to, and I urge you to attend. Several of our panelists can speak to some of these newer policies and to differences at different points along the border, and would be glad to do so in the question and answers that will follow the discussion. And I just wanted to introduce Rachel, our new, stand up Rachel, our new recent advocate for Latin America, Central America, and Mexico, who we're so excited will be joining us in our advocacy on this, and she'll be taking questions at the end of the event, the end of the conversation. So let me start with Paulina, and I'll just ask a question to just get the ball rolling. Can you describe the founding and programming of Espacio Migrante, the shelter and community center that you work at, and just discuss a little bit about what the focus was before the Remain in Mexico policy started, how it has changed with the policy.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much, Refugee International and Yael, for this opportunity. I think it's very important because it seems like MPP and all the issues Remain in Mexico and all the issues at the border are very invisible in the rest of the country. So I'm very happy to be able to share this. Espacio Migrante is a community organization based in Tijuana. It was started in 2012, and we've been changing the way that we work, responding to the needs at the border. So in the beginning, we started working mostly with deportees and migrants passing by. And in 2016, we were very active working with the Haitian migration that arrived to Tijuana. We received about 20,000 Haitians that arrived to Tijuana to seek asylum in the US. And in the end, 3,000 of them ended up staying in Tijuana. So we had to shift the way that we worked and not only focus on being a transit city, but also being a forced destination for hundreds of families. So we started a community center where we offer Spanish classes, legal assistance in Mexico for asylum seekers in Mexico who want to apply for refugee status in Mexico. And we also do education programs to give access to university or high school. And last year, we received another big challenge, which was the arrival of the migrant caravan. So thousands of families from Central America. And we also had to change the way that we did things. So we decided to open up a shelter. We had been doing the community work for a while. We have our community center, but the shelter is a new project that we started in February. It's a shelter for families and also some cases of unaccompanied minors. We have capacity for 40 people, and since February, we've received about 200 people from 10 different countries. So now it's not only from Central America, although the majority is still from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, but we've had people from Cameroon, Haiti, Cuba, Venezuela, and many different places. And we provide housing and food for the time that they need while they wait to seek asylum in the US, while they wait on this metering list. And before, when we started in February, it was for a couple of months that they had to stay at the shelter. But in May, we started receiving people back. After they waited on the list and they pleaded for asylum, they spent 24 hours in the US and then they got sent back to Tijuana to wait for their hearings in Tijuana. So this changed the way that we work because now people are staying for longer periods of time. Now, instead of 2 or 3 months, we're having people for 8 months or maybe a year. It's really uncertain because things change so much and it's a new program. And we also face new challenges because now we need to connect with organizations in the US to find legal representation for them. Now we're seeing other challenges like mental health because families are waiting for so long, and issues such as safety and things like that, enrolling children in school and things like that.
Can you talk a little bit more about some of the cases that you've handled? And again, like the thing that you just ended with, talk a little bit about, if people are meant to wait for several months in Mexico, some of the mental health challenges that people have, and how you've been able to get people some of the services that they desperately need.
Yes, so when people are returned through MPP, when they go into Mexico, they receive a permit that is not valid to have work, to be legally employed in Mexico. So it's just a tourist permit. So that makes it very hard for people that are waiting for almost a year to be able to even work in Mexico. Also, most of the shelters only have only take in families for a couple of days or weeks, depending on each shelter. And people then are left to find another shelter or to go and find a room to rent. But if they're not working, then it becomes harder for them. And we also have seen that all of these families come from a very violent situation in their home countries. Most of them had suffered some sort of violence crossing through Mexico, either kidnapping, sexual assault. And now that they're in Tijuana, and many of them can be easily contacted by their aggressors, and that creates a state of anxiety. And we've seen many mental health issues such as depression, stress. We've had to deal with crisis right there at the shelter. For example, there was a young mother. Most of the families are single mothers with their children. There was a young mother with her 2 children, and she crossed through Texas. And she also suffered a kidnapping by one of the cartels. She finally made it to Texas, and she was returned through San Diego. And so after waiting for a couple months, she became very desperate. And one night she decided to leave the shelter and try to show up at the port of entry and ask to be allowed in. And she called us crying and saying that she wanted to commit suicide because she couldn't get through. So that was very strong for us. And we had to go pick her up, calm her down. And she was in such a state of crisis that we had to take her to the hospital. So the shelters in Tijuana, first of all, we're trying to find how to provide the basic needs like food and housing. And it's hard for us to also find other services that are very needed, such as mental health and legal representation. For example, in Tijuana, there's really no free psychological programs. There's a few volunteers, but they're also going to all the shelters, so it's very difficult.
Thank you. And can you talk a little bit about the, Paulina introduced me to 2 different women, one who was sort of separated from her daughter from Guatemala and then decided to return there. If you could speak a little bit about her case. And also the woman who, I can't express how hard it is to find enough attorneys to take the cases of the people who returned to Mexico. We're talking about thousands and thousands of people. But I was able to find an attorney for one of the women staying at Paulina's shelter. So if you could maybe talk a little bit about those 2 cases just so we could have some human stories.
Yes, so the first case that Yael mentions, she's a mother from Guatemala. She came with her 3 children. The oldest is 18 years old. So when they crossed to the U.S. to seek asylum, the oldest daughter was placed in detention, and the mother and 2 minor children were returned to Tijuana. Another issue is that when they get returned to Tijuana, it can be at any time, and they're even returning people at midnight. And most people don't know where they're going to spend the night, so it's up to them to find transportation, to find a hotel. So when she was returned to Tijuana, they attempted to kidnap her, and she was able to find help. And when she arrived with us, she was in a very difficult psychological state. She only lasted for a couple of weeks with us. We tried to find a psychologist to talk to her, but she was really so afraid to be in Tijuana where she knows nobody, and she knew nothing about her daughter who was in detention in the U.S., that in the end she decided to go back to Guatemala. She's in Guatemala. Yael and I have been talking to her, but the person, her ex-partner that she was fleeing from, is still in Guatemala, and she's still at danger. So these are the things that these policies are pushing people to do, to flee for their safety, even in a place where they thought they would find safety. And the other issue is a woman who's fleeing domestic violence, and her ex-partner is a gang member as well. So she has suffered a lot of abuse. But luckily, we were able to find an attorney for her. We have about 30 people that remain in Mexico, and we're an organization. We're also a nonprofit in California. We're part of a coalition in San Diego. So we always speak up and try to reach out to attorneys, and still we have only been able to find 2 attorneys. So imagine people with no networks, who don't speak English. It's even harder. So, and I wanted to share one last story. We have a family from El Salvador. It's the parents and 2 adult daughters, 19 and 20 years old. One of the daughters suffered sexual violence from a gang member, and originally they only wanted to find a safe space, so they fled to Mexico, and they applied for asylum in Mexico. While they were in Mexico City, they were also threatened and assaulted, and they decided to come to the border in Tijuana. They were placed on the list and waited for a couple months, and then they were placed in Remain in Mexico. And because they don't have small children, it's been even harder for them to find an attorney, and basically they're still waiting. Because I have been able to go to a couple of hearings with them, even when people say that they're afraid to be in Mexico, that they have proof that they've been assaulted or kidnapped in Mexico, they're still being sent back to Tijuana.
Thank you so much. Just for the sake of time, I think we'll move on, but Paulina can certainly take your questions afterwards. So I'll pass it on to Ursula.
Thanks, Yael. So I'm Ursula Ojeda with the Women's Refugee Commission, and I want to start off by thanking Refugees International and thanking Yael for putting together this panel. The Remain in Mexico program, thank you, Taylor. The Remain in Mexico program, also called MPP, also called Migration Persecution Protocols, is nothing short of a disaster and a farce. It provides nothing even close to protection for the nearly 60,000 people that have been returned to Mexico through this policy, and it has led to the separation of hundreds, if not thousands, of families in various iterations. WRC has been working on this, working to end this horrible policy since it was announced nearly a year ago last December. We published a report in April in El Paso after the policy rolled out there, and shortly after that, we started hearing about cases of families that were separated through this policy. When a family comes to the border and is separated, the child becomes unaccompanied. So they're actually sent from DHS custody, Department of Homeland Security, to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is a part of an entirely different government agency, the Department of Health and Human Services. So when CBP or OFO is separating these families, when they're taking a parent away from a child, they're sending that child into the US to a shelter somewhere around the country and returning that family member back to Mexico, without keeping track or recording the information on the family member and without providing any way for that child to be put in touch with that family member. It's nothing short of cruel and barbaric. So in August of this year, WRC submitted a complaint to the Department of Homeland Security, Office of the Inspector General, and Civil Rights and Civil Liberties component for 20 documented cases of family separations through this program. I can't overstate how difficult it is to find these cases, to find these families, despite the heroic work of people all along the border, like Paulina, like Taylor, like others who are trying to help families in this program. This policy really just needs to end. Otherwise, more families will be separated and more people will be harmed. Yes. So I actually have the distinct pleasure, thank you, Taylor, of introducing a general badass of the immigration world, Taylor Levy from El Paso. I met Taylor earlier this year for the first time in person in Juarez at 6 o'clock in the morning. She was helping a young Cuban boy cross into the United States and ask for asylum. And she was just standing out there, 6 o'clock in the morning, untired after having been every single morning that week to help people show up for court and remain in Mexico. After we spent 3 hours trying to help this child cross, she went to immigration court and then acted as friend of the court, helping desperate, really confused, really scared people understand their rights in this process, something she's no longer allowed to do, unfortunately, in the immigration court system. She's been fighting back against Remain in Mexico all this year, but before that, she was fighting to keep families together last year after they were cruelly separated through zero tolerance and continue to be separated. So welcome, Taylor, an immigration attorney from El Paso, Texas.
Thanks, Ursula. Okay. Hi, I'm Taylor. Levy, my last name, I should say that. Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate those introductions. It's funny when I hear them telling stories about me. I'm like, oh yeah, you were there, because everyone has come down to El Paso, it feels like, in the last year and a half now. A lot of people in this room, luckily, have gotten to know me in El Paso or Juarez as well, and thank you so much for coming down and caring. But it's this crazy thing where it used to be, I would say I was from El Paso, and people would be like, oh, I have a cousin in Dallas. And I'd be like, okay, it's like really far away. Like Denver's literally closer. And they're like, oh. I'm like, yeah. But now everyone's like, oh my God, you're from El Paso. That's and I'm like, yeah, exactly. Because what this administration has done is taken El Paso and make El Paso be the pilot and the epicenter of every single cruel and horrific program you can do when it comes to treating refugees and immigrants. We were the pilot for family separation, in the summer of 2017 before it was widely announced. Now we're the pilot for the ACA, the Asylum Cooperation Agreements, of sending people back to Guatemala, of PACER, of trying to get people deported within 20 days and having their credible fear interviews and their immigration judge actual court hearings by telephone in Border Patrol holding cells with zero access to counsel. And this is all just El Paso, El Paso, El Paso over and over again. And so I'm very excited that Fatima is able to join us today by Skype. I wish she was able to join us here in person. Fatima is an incredibly strong woman, just a super chingona. Working on her case was wonderful, other than how incredibly sad it was. And I think that she's so emblematic of so many things that are happening in El Paso, because she crossed, as an asylum seeker with her little brother and with her daughter in May. She ended up spending 57 days in Border Patrol custody. So in the hieleras, 57 days, no access to counsel in the hieleras, being allowed to shower about once a week or so. She was actually 12 days in Clint, even though Clint's the really horrible one that people hear about, that, AOC came down and everyone. She was in Clint even though she's an adult, because they were trying to figure out what to do with her and her daughter. Because Fatima's story is very sad. She was raped at 13, and when she was raped, she was rendered pregnant from that rape, decided to have the baby, but under Nicaraguan law, could not recognize the baby as her own child, and her parents had to be the people put on that birth certificate. So when she crossed the border, she had all of the hospital paperwork saying that she was the mother. She had her birth certificate that said her parents were the parents, because they had to be, because she was a minor child. It was impossible for her to be the mother listed on the birth certificate. Had all of the hospital paperwork showing she was the real mother, had a cesarean scar, everything else. And so that's why they put her in Clint, because they didn't know what to do. But in that situation, ripping the child away from its mother is not the right solution. The right solution is, okay, well, we're going to have social workers figure it out, contact the consulate. And so that's what they were doing for about 12 days, supposedly. She thought she was waiting for the DNA test. And instead, all of a sudden, one day, the Border Patrol agents came up to her and they said, we're going to the airport. They drove them to the airport, and then they told her in the car there at the airport, your daughter is leaving. She's going somewhere else. You need to tell her you're going to be on the next plane and that she needs to go with us nicely. And if not, we're just going to rip her out of your arms anyway. So you better tell her that. And so she's in the situation where she was like, what's the best thing to do psychologically for my daughter? And she decided to tell her, I know, don't worry, Mama's like, I'll be on the next plane. And after that, she didn't see her daughter again for about 4 months. So she was transferred out of Clint. Her little brother was taken from her as well, as is the standard procedure, because she was not the legal guardian of her brother, even though she did have permission to be with him. So he was taken away as well. She was now an adult. She's 19. She was transferred to adult holding cells and spent a total of 57 days in custody before being sent back to Mexico. We actually found out about her case because someone from the government who was helping the child leaked to a large national organization about this horrific thing that happened. Could someone in El Paso help? Right? And then they call me because I'm the crazy person running around trying to find the worst of the worst cases to help on. But we couldn't find Fatima. And that's like what Ursula is saying. That's one of the worst things about these types of family separation is when you just dump people on the streets of Mexico, 17,000 people in Juarez, there's only 1,500 people in shelters. So even the people who were able to access the legal community is this tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of who's actually been sent back. And so we were looking for Fatima for weeks and weeks and found her accidentally. One of my colleagues like ran into her at a shelter, and that's how I was able to take on her case and work on her case. We had to fight really extensively about the illegality of the separation, eventually getting into DNA test. We had all ICE and CBP and ORR all fighting over who would pay for it. They refused to allow us to pay for it, even if we used official agencies. Finally, we were able to get to do it with lots of threats to sue. When I got the DNA test, my favorite part about coming out of, as soon as we were driving out of the port of entry after getting the DNA test, for one, Border Patrol purposely put us in a room next to where all the families were, where they're being held in the hieleras. And I know that they did that on purpose because there was no reason for them to put us in that room, like to wait. And they were like giving them all these toys and feeding them like in front of us, like very performatively to like show. So I think I could talk to the press and be like, oh, it's nice now in the holding cells. But as we were driving away, Lizzo's song came on about got a DNA test, comes out. And so we got to sing that together, me and Fatima, as we were driving back to the shelter. So she's incredibly strong. It took, like I said, about 4 months for us to finally get the order that they take her out of Remain in Mexico, take her out of the program. She got to go with her parents who are here in the U.S. as asylum seekers as well. And then it took another couple weeks for them to bring Cassandra back to her. So Cassandra's with her here today. I'm going to interpret for her, but that's kind of her background. Entonces, Fátima, ¿sí me escuchas? No. A ver, está... Fátima? Sí, sí. Hola. Entonces ya le toca. Yo sé que no nos puede ver, pero es que ya yo expliqué un poco de quién eres y cómo conocimos, pero si usted quiere decir cómo era su experiencia, y yo le voy a traducir, ¿ok?
Bien.
Pues ándale.
Mi experiencia en la frontera fue muy difícil.
My experience was very
quisiera-
difficult.
No quisiera volver a vivir esa etapa de mi vida.
I would never want to have to relive this stage of my life.
Estoy consciente de que crucé ilegalmente,
I'm conscious of the fact that I crossed illegally,
pero estaba desesperada
but this was out of absolute desperation
porque estaba corriendo peligro en mi país,
because I was running away from violence and danger in my country.
porque no, porque solo por pensar diferente sos un delincuente,
Only because
por levantar la bandera de tu país, te meten preso, por llevarle agua a personas que están haciendo huelga de hambre, te meten preso por cosas que no valen la pena.
Because in my country, they
te
could
meten
treat you as a
preso.
criminal for anything, like bringing water to people who are on hunger strike, speaking out politically, and anything. It's just not worth it.
Tengo mucho miedo de regresar a Nicaragua,
I'm very afraid to return to my city, my country.
mientras siga el presidente que está.
So I'm very thankful to be here now.
También tengo miedo de regresar a Nicaragua por el hombre que me hizo daño cuando tenía 13 años.
I'm also afraid to return to Guatemala or to Nicaragua because of the man who hurt me when I was 13 years old.
Él me mandó a amenazar estando en la cárcel.
He's been sending lots of threats to hurt me, even though he's still in prison.
El gobierno está sacando a todos los simpatizantes de su partido.
The government right now is letting lots of people out of prison who are political party members.
Y tengo mucho miedo a que saquen a esa persona.
And I'm very afraid that the government is going to let him out of prison early, like they've been doing for other folks, and that he's going to hurt me.
Porque es parte del gobierno.
¿Por qué? Because he's part of the government party in power.
Lo que viví en la frontera no se lo deseo ni a mi peor enemigo.
Okay. I can't.
What I went through in the border, I don't wish it, not even to my worst.
What I went through at the border, I wouldn't even wish it to my worst enemy. Se habla un poco más alta, ¿ok?
Ok.
Sí, perdón.
Lloré como nunca había llorado.
I was crying and crying for everything that happened.
cuando me separaron de la niña, creo que no puedo describir ese dolor.
When they separated me from my daughter, I don't even think it's possible to describe that pain.
Fue demasiado duro.
It was just too hard.
Cómo nos trataban
The way in which they treated us,
inhumanamente.
completely inhumane.
Casi pasé casi un mes sin bañarme.
I was almost a month and a half there detained.
Nos trataban peor que un animal.
They treated us worse than animals.
Gracias a Dios me encontré con personas que me pudieron ayudar.
Thanks be to God, I was able to find myself with people who are able to help me.
Pero hay muchas personas que no corren con esa suerte.
But there's a lot of people who have not been able to find that same kind of luck.
Es difícil, aún no puedo superar eso.
It's really difficult to try and survive something like this.
Estoy tan agradecida con las personas que me han ayudado,
I'm really, really thankful to the people who have been able to help me.
pero el dolor al ver que se me llevaban a la niña y que no me creían que era mi hija fue muy difícil.
But the pain and the suffering that I experienced of them not believing that she was my daughter was just incredibly difficult.
Y gracias a las personas que me ayudaron, puedo decir que estoy con ella.
And thankful for the people who were able to help me, I was able to finally get her back. ¿Y ahora cómo están ustedes?
Estamos bien, gracias a Dios.
Now we're doing pretty well, thanks be to God. ¿Está ella con usted?
Sí,
¿Sí se sale o no? Hola, Cassandra. ¿Cómo estás?
¿cómo estás?
Qué bien. She says she's good. ¿Y cuántos años tiene Cassandra?
¿Cuántos años tienes?
Oh, she's 5 years old. And Cassandra, what's your favorite? ¿Cuál es tu comida favorita?
¿Cuál es tu comida favorita? Dile,
I said, what's your favorite food?
¿cuál es tu comida favorita? Las tortillas.
Las tortillas, wow. Ni la chocolate ni la pizza, los tortillas.
Ni los chocolates ni la pizza.
I think she's shy. Pues gracias, Fátima. Y también le quería preguntar otra cosa. En su experiencia, ¿hay mucha gente, como en su albergue, había mucha gente con abogados o no?
No,
So I asked her if there were a lot of people in her shelter with lawyers, for example, and she said no. ¿Ahí en su albergue había alguien más con abogados o usted no más?
yo y dos muchachas que están detenidas.
Okay. She said, so in her shelter, I asked her if there were other people with lawyers. She said her and then 2 other people had gotten lawyers at that shelter. ¿Y cómo se le tratan a ustedes cuando viene para las cortes?
Igual, ahí a veces bien, a veces mal, pero más mal que bien.
So I asked her, how do they treat you when you have to come back for your court hearings? And she said, oh my God, the same. So when you imagine this, I'm editorializing, but she went through 57 days of being in this absolute hell. And then every time you have to come back for court, you have to come back to that same hell. So she was alone because her daughter was stolen from her. But a lot of the parents, when we start walking towards the bridge with them, the kids start freaking out because they don't want to have to go back to those bad men. And they'll start pulling on their pants and being like, no, mama, no, because they don't want to go back to the Border Patrol agents because they're so awful to them. So that's what I asked her, like, how did they treat you when she came back for her courts? And she's like, well, some were good and some were bad, but way more bad people than good people. Because when you go to each one of your court hearings, if you ask for a fear interview in Mexico, which you only have, maybe a 5% chance of passing. The government just put out stats of 13%, but I think it's bullshit. But okay, let's say you're almost for sure not going to pass, but that means you have to spend about 3 nights in the hieleras. So if you go to your court hearing and you don't ask for the fear interview, you hopefully will only be in those horrible holding cells getting yelled at for only about a day. But if you ask for your fear interview, which you almost for sure won't pass, you're going to be 3 days. And so we see people not wanting that as well. ¿Y usted pidió la entrevista de miedo en México?
Sí la pedí.
Yeah, so I asked her if she asked for the non-refoulement interview, the fear interview in Mexico. ¿Y cómo fue?
Pues me dijeron que si me creía única y especial porque me podía pasar algo.
I didn't understand exactly what she said.
Le preguntaron, they asked her if she felt special and unique because something could happen to her.
Yeah. So, I mean, she kind of laughed when I asked how was the interview, and she's like, no, I mean. Entonces, ¿pensaba que si algo que le iba a ayudar o no?
No, porque yo les dije que tenía miedo de regresar a México y me dijeron de que si me creía única y especial, ¿por qué me podía pasar algo a mí?
And so I kept telling them, no, I'm afraid to go back to Mexico. I'm afraid to go back to Mexico. Something bad will happen. And all they kept responding is, well, what makes you special? Why would something specially happen to you in particular? Which is exactly the standard, but in the way it feels is crazy.
Y yo les dije, no me creo única y especial, pero no les voy a decir de que me pasó algo hasta de que, no sé, esté secuestrada o me hayan matado.
So, I mean, I was like, well, I don't feel special, but I'm really scared. But why am I going to keep staying here until something bad does happen to me, such as that they kidnap me or they kill me? ¿Y usted conoce a gente que sí fueron secuestrados?
Así directamente no, pero en las noticias han salido que han matado la vez a cubanos.
So I asked her if she knew anyone personally who had been kidnapped, and she said directly no, but it's come out in the newspapers about the murdered Cubans who were kidnapped and murdered. Y allí también en las cortes hay gente que dicen de eso, ¿sí? O en las celdas.
Sí, así dicen.
Yes, so also that there were people in the cells and in the courts who were talking about having been kidnapped. ¿Hay algo más que quieren decir antes de que empezamos con las preguntas?
No.
Pues muchas gracias. Y queda en línea ya, porque ya vamos a hacer las preguntas, ¿eh? Okay.
Okay, Taylor, did you want to say anything else about sort of how Remain in Mexico or other El Paso epicenter policies have been rolling out, or you want to just open up for questions? Up to you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just things are crazy. It makes it incredibly hard to try and advise people on Juarez as well when things become new over and over and over again, and there's so incredibly much fear. We have a lot of people. It's more in Matamoros, and that has to do with the geography of it in Matamoros because the refugee camp is right there at the bridge. More and more kids are able to cross alone. In Juarez, just the way it's set up geographically and the way the cartels kind of control the border area, it's much harder to send children alone. But I've been asked by multiple parents here, will you just take my child across instead for me, please? Even though that means they're losing their child because they're like, this is the only way I can keep my child alive. And so we are seeing that a lot with the new fear, you know, that people are going to get sent to Guatemala. That's an absolutely insane thing to try and explain people. They're like, no, but I'm Honduran. They like think I don't understand Spanish. I'm like, and they're like, no. And I'm like, no, they're going to put you on a plane and fly you to Guatemala. And they're like, no, but why would they do that? I'm Honduran. I'm like, and it's an absurd thing to try and explain. And like Ursula was talking about, your all's report had 20 people, right? 20 cases of family separation. I represented 3 of those cases out of their 20, you know, out of El Paso Juarez. And luckily we were able to succeed on all of them. But just like Fatima, where we found her accidentally, we had another case, same thing, leaked to a big national organization, somebody who represented the kid and felt unconscious. And that case, it took us 3 months to find that father, and we found him 100% accidentally. I had some lawyers in town who were watching court and happened to run into him. We'd been looking for him for 3 months everywhere. And he was separated from his 14-year-old son. The story goes because the Border Patrol agent ripped up the birth certificate in front of him and said, you're a liar, and then just put the kid into OR custody and sent the dad back. And the OR, whoever had leaked it very soon early on because it was just ridiculous. But we couldn't find him for 3 months to be able to help him because that's what happens. And yesterday I was in court, for example, and one of our judges retired theoretically in protest. She wasn't very loud about it, but she had complained a lot. So yesterday I was in court, and all these people had gone to court. They get up at 4 a.m. to show up in the dark in this insanely dangerous city to go to court, and her entire docket had just been canceled because they still haven't replaced her. So all these people who have been waiting about 3-4 months for their court hearing, waiting and gathering their evidence, and almost none of them have lawyers. You know, one had attorney out of these like 80-some people. They're all like sitting there with their little cold babies because it's like freezing in the courtroom too, and they're just waiting, and every one of them just gets a reset notice, come back in February, come back in February, come back in February. And allegedly, when we're there, it helps, but we're not allowed to represent them like that. We used to be allowed to do friend of court, and then they banned friend of court. They actually just wrote a memo that friend of court isn't allowed, and there's only like 5 of us in the country who do friend of court, and I'm one of them. So I'm like, oh, thanks for writing a memo about me. So I'm banned. But they weren't even able to ask for their Fear in Mexico interview because it's the judge that asks. And since the court administrator was like, sorry, there's no judge, here's your reset, they don't even ask them, hey, do you want your Fear in Mexico interview? Which is just absurd. I don't even understand, honestly, how many people are still willing to go to these farcical courts because they are that absurd. In El Paso, we've had 1 single win the entire time since the program started in April, 1 asylum win.
On that happy note. So I'm just going to open it up for questions, and we can start by doing them like one at a time, and then I can take a few depending on how many people have questions. So, questions?
Hi, I'm Adam Isaacson from WOLA. The question is just, those who are not lucky enough to get a spot in a shelter, where are they in these border towns? And I would actually, on that, in El Paso, apparently the Mexican federal government has a shelter that they built that's the only one on the border. What are the conditions there like?
So, I mean, in El Paso, in Juarez, there is a federal shelter. Tanya, actually here from Clinic, works in the shelter a lot, so you should connect with her later. You should raise your hand, Tanya. I'm going to put you on the spot. No? You're just like going to refuse to.
Tanya.
So she's in the federal shelter a lot. The federal shelter is, I don't know, there's a lot of varying opinions on it. It is officially when they launched it, you were allowed to be there a week, and then they changed it, you were allowed to be there 3 weeks. In practice, they let a lot of people stay longer. And it is, if I was going to pick a shelter where I wanted my child to be the safest, it's what I would pick because it's surrounded by soldiers. So there's very little kidnapping that's going to happen of like in the shelter. Like the shelter will get raided, which does happen at the other shelters, but people are still kidnapped outside of the shelter. And inside internally, it's basically one ginormous warehouse with not enough security. So we do hear about like some sexual type violence between actual migrants in the shelter. And it's just not a very like, it's not horrific, but I think what's the current population like? It's between 500 to 1,000.
Right now it's between 650 to 700.
So she said 650 to 700 right now. And then in the other shelters, there's about 15 private shelters, and that's where I'm running around a lot in an old muddy Jeep all the time to the different shelters. None of them are somewhere I would ever want my children to be. I mean, they're all incredibly problematic. I believe that they're all pretty much run by very well-meaning people, but well-meaning people who have no clue what they're doing. And a lot of them are literally in buildings that should be condemned and in incredibly dangerous neighborhoods. So we hear about shelter raids quite a bit, kidnappings within the shelters, and people kidnapped outside of the shelters all the time. Those shelters are actually getting funding right now from IOM, from the Department of State, but I think it's just also, it's all about just making it look like, we are supporting the shelters. And then in El Paso, Juarez, for whatever reason, we do have some refugee camps, kind of like Matamoros, but they're only Mexican asylum seekers allowed to stay in those camps, because if Central Americans try and stay in those camps, they're kicked out by the Mexican refugees themselves, which is kind of code word by whatever cartel controls that area for whatever reason is tolerating Mexicans camping and is not tolerating Central Americans or Cubans. So a lot of them are living in small rented rooms, in hotels, motels, which are raided by kidnappers as well all the time, and in abandoned buildings as well.
So in Tijuana, there's about 25 shelters, but it's not only for MPP, but also deportees and internally displaced people, so there's obviously not enough room. A lot of people are renting hotel rooms in Centro, which is also a dangerous area. And another challenge that we have in Tijuana is the presence of the Mexican National Guard. We saw the deployment of the Guard since June, and they have been working with INAMI, with Mexican Immigration, to raid some of these hotels and rooms and detaining people. Some of the people they're detaining are on the list to wait to seek asylum in the U.S. or even are MPP. And usually, if they're an MPP, they get released after a couple of days, but it's still very stressful being detained. And on the other hand, they have been stopping also African and Haitian migrants, and they have been returning them to the southern Mexican border.
Thank you. My name is Santiago Macay. I work for Save the Children. I was just in El Paso about 2 weeks ago, and I attempted to go to one of the immigration courts. Unfortunately, I was not able to actually go. But I did see that the docket for the afternoon had 87 cases. Most of them were MPP. Only about 6 of them had legal representation. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. How many of those, because I can't imagine a judge would hear 87 individuals in one afternoon. How many of those individuals do show up, and then what is the, I guess, resolution for all of those cases?
So they're group hearings. So he would have, or he or she would have, but they're mostly men, would have heard all those cases theoretically, because they do them as group hearings and they're short little hearings when you see a docket like that. It depends a lot. At the beginning, when MPP started in El Paso, we did a lot of court watching and a lot of this thing called friend of court. So they would let us go do talks before court, explain people's rights, and then also not represent them because we didn't want to be fully representing them, but help like navigate the process. And now that's all banned. I've been told repeatedly that I will be arrested if I speak to anyone while I'm there in the hallway. People will ask me questions, and I literally have to say, I can't talk to you. I've also was told once that I was going to be physically removed for smiling at them. And because they were like, oh, I saw you, you smiled, like you winked. And then yesterday when I was in court, they don't even allow us on the floor of court anymore. They actually make us wait on the first floor. So yesterday there was more lawyers than usual. It was me and 2 other lawyers who we were just observing. I wasn't representing anyone, but I brought them to observe because like you weren't able to get in, but they know that I talk to the press a lot. So if I bring people, it's easier to get them in. So that's what I was doing. And then there were about 5 other attorneys actually representing around 400 people on the docket. So there were 5 attorneys representing around up to 400 people were on the docket. We were downstairs in the waiting room of the building, like doing nothing, and we took a picture of us like all laughing, like that we were all female lawyers. So we're like, yeah, rah rah, femin, chingonas basically. And so we took that picture, and then 5 minutes later, the court administrator came down from the 7th floor, busted out of the elevator and screamed just at me and was like, Taylor, photos are banned. You know this. And I was like, what are you talking about? I'm not in the court. You don't work. What? Like, you don't run the building. You run the court on the 7th floor. And he's like, why are you taking photos? And I was like, we took a picture of us as lawyers. Like, we posed for it. It was obvious. And so that's how lawyers are treated, I guess is my point, like consistently. So even if you have money, there are not enough attorneys to take these cases because they're absolutely and utterly miserable. The court starts at 8 a.m. or starts at 8:30 a.m. Officially, you have to be there. If you're not there, they're gonna skip you. But court usually starts at like 11. So you just have to sit on that first floor and apparently not take pictures or you're gonna get screamed at. And on top of that, the day before yesterday, today's Wednesday, right? So on Monday, a bunch of my friends, those same lawyers there on Tuesday, had been there on Monday. They had all signed in on that spreadsheet. They were downstairs. They had signed in at 7:45, and the court forgot to get them. So the court started court without all of them, without all of the attorneys who were representing their clients. And these were all paid attorneys. They like their clients had paid a lot of money. They forgot to get them and started court without them. Finally, the lawyers like went up again to be like, why'd you forget? Like, they're like, oh shoot, court started. And they're like, what the hell are you talking about? Let me have my clients. And they're like, no, but court already started. It's too late. So one of my friends got into a huge fight with the administrator. He threatened to physically remove her. She's a Cuban, and Cubans sometimes are pretty good at arguing. And she said she was in like a big old fight with him. He was threatening to arrest her, and she kept screaming at him. And finally, he was like, okay, fine, and got her client. The 2 other lawyers backed down because he was literally threatening to arrest them. And those 2 other lawyers had their clients go through their whole court as pro se with all the other pro se people without lawyers. And they were all just given reset dates for February, like new dates for February. And only the lawyer who's threatened to be arrested repeatedly was able to get an actual final asylum court hearing for April. So the two other ones who these families had paid them probably a couple $1,000s to be there, most likely, because they had flown in from Miami, both of those attorneys. They weren't even allowed access. My point of all of this is it's a nightmare and no one wants to take these cases. And so one of the biggest things I do is try and convince private attorneys to take the cases anyway, because even if you've paid, like even when we have families who can pay, because the vast majority of people are way too broke to pay and there's not enough free lawyers, but even paid, we can't get people to take these cases because it's a total and complete joke. Like it's pointless, you're screamed at, you're there for hours. Attorneys don't want to be treated that way. Who wants to be treated that way? So. And Save the Children, by the way, Mexico, not Save the Children US, they just opened up little escuelitas, little schools in a couple of the shelters in Mexico, and it's been in Juarez, and it's been one of the best things. So something we didn't talk about. Technically, you're allowed to go to school as a migrant, but in Juarez, almost none of the migrant kids are in the schools because they're so terrified of being kidnapped. Like their parents are terrified of letting them out of the shelters to go to the schools. So Save the Children opened up 2 little escuelitas, which are beautiful, and thank you.
Do you want to say something about the schools?
Yes, so I wanted to mention that we were able to enroll 6 of the children at the shelter in public school in Tijuana. So Tijuana has a program especially for migrant children, and this is because a group of deported parents have been putting a lot of pressure for this. So we were able to enroll them in school, and we also have Save the Children Mexico come to our shelter and do activities. I wanted to mention something about the situation with attorneys. So in the Tijuana-San Diego border, there was a blacklist made, and many activists, journalists, and attorneys were put on the blacklist, and they were denied entrance into Mexico. So the few attorneys that are willing to go to Mexico to represent these families, one of them was stopped when she was traveling to Guadalajara with her family, and she was placed like in a room for like 7 hours. And the other, she was walking into Tijuana. She has her husband and her son are in Tijuana. She's a U.S. lawyer, and she was denied entrance to Tijuana. And after speaking with the Mexican government, it turned out that it was the U.S. who placed a alerta migratoria, like an immigration alert. So the U.S. is trying to stop the few attorneys who can represent people from coming into TJ.
Other questions?
Hi, I'm Jessica Bolter from the Migration Policy Institute. I have a question about kind of the capacity of MPP, particularly in the places where you are. Are they able to send basically all Central American families back through MPP? Are there people who are still being released or put into other systems? What's that like?
So right now we don't know exactly what the agreements were. At the height of the crossings when MPP started, at first it was a pilot in El Paso, so it was about 50 a day, and then they upped it to 200 to 300 people return per day. Mexicans on the ground, like government Mexicans told us off record that it was supposed to be capped at 200, but CBP keeps sending 300. But that was the peak. Now we have fewer crossings. So there's way fewer crossings. So I think some days it'll be only like 30 new people, 50 new people, maybe 100, but it really depends. I tend to say, completely anecdotally, not real statistics, I tend to tell Central American families, so Brazilians are exempt, and then Mexicans are treated differently, sometimes paroled in, sometimes in this new program, HARP, and African families, et cetera. But a family unit from Central America, I tend to say have about a 98% chance of being put into MPP. It's almost 100% sure. Sometimes they'll get out, we don't know why, because they're pregnant, or because they're really sick, or because maybe they passed an non-refoulement interview once in a million years, or honestly because like the van broke down, or they got a really nice Border Patrol agent and there's no explanation why they weren't put in. But then for single males, we still have all these contracts that we need to fill with ICE beds. We need to fill up ICE beds. And so with single males, I tend to say it's 50-50 of whether or not they're going to be put into MPP or put into ICE detention. And single females, I tend to say 80-20 for a rough guess, because there's fewer female beds. We do see very consistently let's say a group of like 20 people crosses Iwi and gets caught, we hear repeatedly that they'll find all of the parejas, all the couples, and they'll purposely send one of the couple people back to Mexico and then detain the other one. It seems very, very targeted. It's not 100%. Some couples stay together, but they'll be like, we'll hear from people, well, there were a group of 20 of us and like 14 of the people were all singles, and then there were 6 couples, and every single of the couples was split up. And it's very much a duck, duck, goose situation. They don't screen anyone for your fear in this point. It's just Border Patrol being like, oh, I got to fill 10 ICE beds. ICE said I needed to send 10 today, so I'm going to send the other 10 to Mexico. And that's all they're doing.
If I could just say one thing, which is that to reinforce Taylor's point, like when I visited in the summer, Juarez, they had a pretty good system going on with INM. So I went to the INM tents that receive back the people. Taylor was with us. It was a pretty, they had the capacity to process back like 200-300 people. Around the same time when they had just rolled out the policy in the Rio Grande Valley, that was not the case in Brownsville. So it was a little bit more like the shelters never knew in Laredo if they were going to get some families that day or not. Like it was a little bit more hit or miss. Now it's much more consistent that everybody's being sent back. I just wanted to say, from attending court in the Rio Grande Valley, the port courts and stuff, I heard a lot of people, especially women, tell the judge, my partner is in detention, at her MPP hearing, and the judge would basically say, well, I can't unite you guys. Like, it's not I have no ability to unite you. That's fine that he's in the Rio Grande Valley Detention Center, or he's not that far from here, or he's in Louisiana or something. So anecdotally, I could reaffirm that it does seem like some of the women that I saw come to their port court hearings and remain in Mexico and in Brownsville and in Rio Laredo had been in fact separated from their husbands.
And it's sad, and emotional violence and psychologically sad and awful, and a lot of time the women sent back are at more of a risk. They don't have their male protection partners, etc. But it's also, most of them only have one set of evidence, like physical evidence of what happened to them. And so either detained husband or sent back mom has that one copy, and then they also can't testify in each other's cases. So it's like really diabolical and smart. I'm like convinced that there's orders to find all the parejas and separate them, but it's not written down anywhere.
Hello? Okay. So I know I've talked to you all about this already, but just to sort of fully crystallize this for me, would you be able to sort of describe the conditions in the migrant camps outside of the shelters, and who's managing that? What kind of humanitarian aid exists there to help people in the camps? And only a small proportion of people, even in the shelters, have attorneys. Are people representing migrants in the camps, or is that just extremely rare?
So to clarify, you're talking about the migrant camps in Matamoros in the RGV? Yeah. Okay. So I can talk about that a little bit. I will say that the most recent time I've been to Matamoros was in May, before all of this started. And even then, there were families camped just feet away from the port of entry to the United States to Brownsville, just camped in little makeshift tents right next to a dirty river on a bridge. Since then, with the implementation of Remain in Mexico, that camp has exploded in size to several thousand families that are living in the most deplorable, the most horrid conditions imaginable, without access to running water, without access to safety, without access to regular food, education, or healthcare. And there is really nobody that has stepped in to provide that sort of assistance to these families. The United States government likes to say that Remain in Mexico has all sorts of protections built in by the Mexican government, who's providing these things for people that are in Mexico. But I would invite folks in the room to turn on the news or to go down there and see for yourself that there are no protections put in place and there's nobody stepping in. The U.S. is returning people to danger deliberately and cruelly, and is not holding up any sort of its end of the bargain.
Yeah, so, I mean, again, and I that's absolutely correct. And there's certainly no evident U.S. funding for humanitarian aid, government funding, or international organization funding, like from the UN, visible in Matamoros at all. Again, the State Department, I've heard at Foreign Affairs Committee hearings say that, yes, we support shelters in Mexico. We are giving money to support shelters, but that doesn't help the people in tent camp. And the fact of the matter is that in Matamoros, there really isn't a shelter to go. And even when the local government in Matamoros attempted to build a shelter, and they have built one, it's sort of done on the local level, many people are afraid to go there because they actually do want to stay close to the port. They're scared they'll miss the court hearings, and because there's been an effort by the Mexican authorities and the IOM to return people, to put people on buses to send them south. So they're actually, and there are people at that municipal shelter who are urging people to go home. So they just don't want to be put in that position. And that shelter has very little capacity for a couple hundred people. So not enough. In the camp, I mean, Ursula's main point is the one that should be the takeaway, but there are courageous. I don't want to minimize the work that volunteers are doing because, I mean, people need food. And Team Brownsville, which is a group of volunteers, is bringing food every day, or they're arranging for a restaurant in Matamoros to provide some of the meals. I mean, they're literally every day people are crossing with things over the border. I think what's sort of amazing to see and relates to the geography of this camp is that both because of the danger in the city and the lack of infrastructure there and the lack of civil society groups working on the Mexican side in Matamoros, almost all the supplies and food are literally just brought over the border by volunteers. So anything that's supplying the camp is literally being brought. So the meals are being brought over. They're actually, some of the sandwiches are made in the shelters that used to be housing asylum seekers and are no longer housing them because they're all in Mexico, but that's where they're making the sandwiches in some of the shelters on the US side, bringing the food over. That's what Teams Brownsville does. There are some medical nonprofits that are trying to provide, pop-up medical tents to support the basic medical needs and at least have the capability to, if there is an emergency, like somebody's having a heart attack in the camp, to get that person to a hospital in Mexico. I mean, there's acute, and then just to provide, basic. People get, because as Ursula said, the water is dirty. People are getting rashes, fungus. Basic hygiene issues. That's what these tents can provide. So the very bare minimum. And there's been, on Sundays, there's some really wonderful volunteers, the tias and abuelas, who go over and they offer school on Sundays. It's a Sunday school. But again, this is one day of school, occasionally by some volunteers, and it's not the kind of situation where these children should be in school. In Mexican school, officially, right? They should be allowed to go to school. And I visited Matamoros 3 times, a few times, and my last time there was in September or October. I've sort of lost track. And it's growing. The most obvious thing is that it's growing. It used to be the tent camp was just sort of right by the bridge. Now it's sort of around the corner and then up into the park behind. And the asylum seekers are I heard recently that I saw the stove, they were making their own tortillas. They're trying, people want to be able to work. They don't want to, our organization, Refugees International, sees refugee camps all over the world. People like to be able to be self-sufficient, to sort of just, if there's work, they'll do it. If they can bake their own food, they'll do it. They don't want to just take the food that people bring for them from Teams Brownsville, but they're in a situation where there's very little. And I think the biggest issue is, as Taylor said, and as Ursula said, is the security. So, and if the UN set up a refugee camp, there would be security. That's key, right? Security for the camp. Who can come in? Who can come out? That's not there. And I think that is, and that's a danger. And there was one situation a couple of weeks ago where the asylum seekers actually staying in the camp sort of tried to protest and went to the bridge and tried to stop traffic on the bridge. Unfortunately, it was peaceful in the end, but it actually didn't get enough attention and didn't really change that much in the encampment. And also, but they are organized. They do feel frustrated. There's a frustration there. And I don't know, I'm not going to go on and on, but I do feel like a lot more can be done, and there's sort of a lack of recognition, both by the U.S. government, that this is anything that we should be caring about. And I think what's the most dramatic, this is literally feet from the border. When a parent in the encampment sends their kid to the U.S. alone, they can literally wave to them as they like go to CBP. This is not, I mean, it's right there. So so the moral evasion here is very obvious. It's like black and white to me.
Hi, thanks, Miriam with the Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights. I had a question, Taylor, you were talking about Brazilians being exempt, and I know that DHS has said people with disabilities are exempt from MPP, unaccompanied kids are exempt from MPP, but can some of you speak to how Remain in Mexico is making it difficult for those exempt populations or vulnerable populations to actually access the border and get protection when they need it? Thank you.
So for unaccompanied minors is vulnerable? Okay. Well, first off, Young Center, awesome. Thank you. Y'all had a special advocate for Cassandra, so the little girl here. So not everybody gets. Honestly, something that worked well on Fatima's case versus other cases is the ORR facilities are of differing quality depending on what part of the United States you're in. And luckily, that little girl got sent to New York. And in New York, there's like really strong legal team and Young Center's there. And she was able to get a special advocate. And it super helped because it wasn't just me screaming into the void from down south. It was also the Young Center like being super ferocious on Cassandra's case and, helping with that. So we were able to get them reunited. Yeah, I mean, if you're an unaccompanied minor, you won't be put into Remain in Mexico, and that's why so many people, parents are choosing to send their children alone. What we're seeing is I'm getting a lot of calls because I'm very vocal about MPP, especially like on Facebook, or people find me on listservs or Facebook, calls and emails from attorneys from all over the country who represent those kids from all over the country, like Miami, New York, DC, like everywhere, because they still will have their court hearing docketed for on the border, and they're trying to figure out what should they do. Are they going to get an absentia deportation order if that kid doesn't come back for the court hearing on the border? And what we're seeing incredibly commonly is all of these border courts are so saturated. I actually feel bad for them, even though even the court administrator, who's insanely mean to me and constantly threatens to arrest me, sometimes he's nice because he's kind of bipolar, I see. But sorry, that's a bad joke in Spanish. It's less bad, I think, in English. But he's I even feel bad for him because they are so inundated. They got like 17,000 NTAs filed in 6 months when the backlog for there used to be 5,000 when Trump came into office. So they have so many cases. They don't open their mail. They just have boxes and boxes and boxes of unsorted, unopened mail. And so all of these lawyers representing the kids who are now in OR custody and are trying to do very normal procedures of asking for a change of venue because, hey, same government. It's all the same U.S. government. Different departments, fine. But we got this child in custody. They can't get these change of venues motions even looked at by the judges, more or less granted, because they never open the mail. And so that's really constant. And then I have to awkwardly explain this to lawyers from all over the country of you're probably cool. That's what it breaks down to. Most likely the judge is not going to order a deportation order because most likely the government attorney will do the right thing. We'll see in the computer system that kid is in custody from the other agency, most likely, and will say, they won't order a deportation order. But obviously that's not how lawyers like to function. We don't want to function on this, you're probably cool. So there's a lot of
cool standard.
Okay, it's probably okay. So we have a whole lot of money and time being spent and wasted on lawyers across the country scrambling to get other local border lawyers to come in and cover these hearings. So that's one of the things that I do a whole lot of, including people who are taken out of MPP for being vulnerable populations. They're not given these automatic change of venues either. And so I like people who multiple competency issues. I've represented those cases where they were taken out for being mentally incompetent and then their court was never moved. So then I show up in court to be like, hey, they were paroled in. They have ankle bracelets. So ICE knows where they are. They're going to check-ins. Fatima has an ankle bracelet. That's why she wasn't allowed to come today. So GPS ankle monitors. But if they don't show up for their court, they're ordered deported in absentia. So I'm covering lots and lots of those cases as well, sometimes 2 or 3 a week. And then the judges get annoyed with me because they keep being like, come on, Taylor, I would never actually order someone deported in absentia in this situation. I'm like, yeah, will you put it in writing for me, Your Honor? And, well, no. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to keep coming. Hey. And that's an absurd way to practice law. So, I mean, that's an issue. In terms of unaccompanied minors not being able to access the border, In El Paso, Juarez, that's not as much of an issue, simply the way migrant flows work. But I think that Paulina can talk more about that in Tijuana for sure.
Yeah, so in Tijuana, so we have the list, but in Tijuana, I know in Juarez it's run by the state government of Chihuahua, like the in Mexico. But in Tijuana, it's run very informally by the asylum seekers. It's kept by Mexican immigration, but that means that it's just a handwritten notebook, basically, and minors can't get into that list. So if a minor goes to the port of entry, Mexican authorities will call DIF, which is like Child Protection Services, and legally DIF would have custody of them, and they would be put in a closed shelter and most likely returned to their country. So the way that minors have been able to enter is accompanied by Al Otro Lado, which is one of the organizations of attorneys in Tijuana. And even then, they get rejected a couple of times before being able to get in. There's one shelter for unaccompanied minors, the IMCA, Casa IMCA. We also take unaccompanied minors, but we've seen that minors are scattered all over Tijuana at different shelters and also renting rooms in the red light district. And in December last year, 2 teenagers from Honduras were murdered in downtown Tijuana.
Can you also when I was with Paulina, we spoke to a family who had a child with a severe medical problem, cancer. So maybe you want to speak about that case. And then Ursula also has done a lot of work on this. So
yeah, so it was a family from Guatemala with 2 young babies, a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. The 3-year-old had surgery because he had cancer in his eye. So his eye was removed, and he was living at one of the shelters, but that doesn't have a lot of hygiene conditions. They were basically in tents, sleeping outside, and so the dirt and the lack of hygiene were hurting him more, and he was referred to us at the shelter, and we were working. There's an organization called Refugee Health Alliance. It's a group of volunteer doctors that are going to different shelters. Now they have a space with us in Espacio Migrante, and we were all working together to be able to take them out of MPP. And they were recently taken finally out of MPP, but there's hundreds of cases like that, people with diabetes, with different conditions, and they're still being placed in MPP.
I think just to echo what Taylor and Paulina have said, like, it's important to remember that MPP isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening on top of every other evil attack on asylum that this administration and administrations before have levied against asylum seekers at our border. So when an unaccompanied child or somebody who's disabled tries to come up to any port of entry to ask for asylum, that is their legal right, before they're placed in MPP, they may be before there's even a possibility of somebody going into MPP, they'll be metered. They'll be turned away from the border, and this changes between locations. But after that, it's important to remember that MPP may not be the worst thing that happens to somebody. Recently, the administration published a federal regulation, Asylum Ban 2.0, to deny a grant of asylum to anybody who didn't apply for asylum in Mexico or in any other country through which they transited before coming here first, and that applies to unaccompanied children. So really, we're just talking about policy on top of policy that is preventing anybody from accessing safety and returning them out of sight, out of mind, to the south of the United States, where we have created a refugee crisis, refugee camps without international actors, without anybody there to help beyond, an NGO world who will always step in and help. But our government has abdicated its responsibilities to protect those who are coming to the United States and exercise their lawful rights for protection.
Great. I think we're out of time. Thank you so much for coming, and we're around to chat and with other people who didn't get a chance to ask your questions. So thanks again for coming.
Entonces, Fátima, ya estamos terminando, ¿ok? Entonces, muchas gracias y todos me van a dar mucha suerte, ¿ok? Y a Cassandra también. Gracias. Adiós. Cuídate.